Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, philosophy students. Today we are going to take up about the last 30 pages of the main essay in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. That's his essay called Experiences in a Concentration Camp. So far we have made it up through about page 65, and so today we're going to look at pages 66 through 93. This is online class number 12 for Friday, April the 17th. All right, so there's a very interesting quote from Dostoevsky that Frankl refers to towards the bottom of page 66. And you remember the whole context of the book is suffering, right? The whole context of the book is reflecting on the fact that sometimes the circumstances that we find ourselves in is a circumstance of unavoidable suffering. And so the question then is, what do we do with that? Is that meaningful? Or is it possible, as many in the world seem to maintain, that suffering is not meaningful? Note here that Frankl is specifically referring to unavoidable suffering. That's where the challenge of meaning is. Sometimes we take on suffering voluntarily. Lent is an example where we mortify ourselves in preparation for Easter, training for an athletic event, or training, let's say, in terms of practicing a musical instrument could be another example. Going through the end of the semester, preparing for final exams and final papers is another example of suffering that we've taken on ourselves, right? So you didn't just sort of arbitrarily find yourself in college. Oh, I'm in college. Oh, I've got final exams to take. Oh, this is going to cause suffering. No, it doesn't work like that. We choose these activities, right? We choose certain activities. This will come up later in life, whether it has to do with challenges in your marriages, challenges with your children, challenges in your careers, challenges in the communities that you live in. All of these things will come up. Sometimes it's hard to tell, did I choose this or did I not choose it? But Frankl is specifically focusing on suffering that comes about by virtue of circumstances which are beyond our control. Is suffering meaningful? So the quote from Dostoevsky at the bottom of page 66 is a very interesting quote. Dostoevsky said, Frankl quotes, "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." You can spend quite a few minutes, hours, days, weeks thinking about what does Dostoevsky mean, and why is this so important to Frankl that we be worthy of our sufferings, unavoidable sufferings. How could it be that we might go through this experience and not be worthy, be unworthy of having experienced this unavoidable suffering? I think what Frankl is trying to refer to, and you can come to your own conclusion, I think he's referring to the way in which unavoidable suffering is an essential part of a meaningful life. And so on the next page, page 67, Frankl notes three primary ways that a life is made meaningful, two of which we're very familiar with: the active life and the passive life. An active life we experience when we're engaged in creative work. A passive life we experience when we are engaged in some form of enjoyment. However, Frankl notes, those are not the only three ways in which meaning is found in life. It's just not the active and passive. It's just not the creative and the enjoyable element of life. Notice a very key sentence. I would probably say this sentence is the key to the entire book, and I think it's probably the key to the entire work and life of Viktor Frankl. Right in the middle of page 67, Frankl says, "If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering." That phrase, that if-then hypothetical phrase, could be used as the first premise of an argument. If you wanted to follow the argument through, you could think about it like this. If there is a meaning in life at all, there must be a meaning in suffering. But there is no meaning in suffering, therefore there is no meaning in life. That's a logically valid argument. If those two premises are true, if there's a meaning in life at all, there must be a meaning in suffering, one premise. The second premise, but there is no meaning in suffering. If those two premises are true, then the conclusion must follow that there's no meaning in life. So in order for life to be meaningful, the elements of life that we accurately call suffering must be meaningful. Notice what he goes on to say. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life. Ineradicable. You can't get rid of it. You can't avoid it. You can't just cut it out. Later on in the book, in the second part, and hopefully I'll remember to make reference to this, Frankl compares a life to the making of a movie. You make a movie and then you go through and you edit and you cut out certain parts. So what if you could do that with life, he says? What if you could go through your life and cut out the elements of life which constitute unavoidable suffering? Would you therefore have a meaningful life? Right? His analogy is that if you cut out too much of what you filmed, then you won't have a meaningful movie. Right? So likewise, he says, if you cut out the parts of life in which you suffer, if they're unavoidable suffering, then your life is not going to be meaningful. Right? It's an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. It's sort of hard to think about it. Even, here we are in a crisis. There's a lot of suffering and death. In every life, regardless if we go through some coronavirus crisis like this, in every life, there's suffering and death. And here's Frankl saying that it is suffering and death which completes life. In other words, he's really saying you have to have it. You can't avoid it. It's a necessary element of life. He goes on. This is still in the middle of 67. Very important section. The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the sufferings it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. We all have difficult circumstances, and certainly we have to admit that the circumstances that Viktor Frankl experienced were extremely difficult. Now, he goes on in the pages following 66 and 67 to give some illustrations of what he means by that. He kind of concludes, in a sense, this section on page 74 with a quote from Spinoza. Here he's talking about how it is that you deal with suffering. And one of Frankl's ideas was that actually, if you clearly visualize the suffering, if you clearly conceptualize it, and in a sense focus on it very clearly, again, unavoidable suffering, not something you've taken on voluntarily. But he says if you clearly focus on it, you will have a better chance of making that suffering meaningful. So he concludes on page 74, this section, with a quote from Spinoza. in Latin. We'll just worry about it in English. He says, emotion which is suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. So he's saying, don't try to blot it out. Don't try to make it fuzzy. Don't try to just get through it and not pay attention to it. Reflect on it. Think about it very clearly. So emotion which is suffering ceases to be suffering once we form a clear and precise picture of it. He illustrates this, as you'll notice in the book, with the example of an instance when he was walking to one of the work sites, and he began to have a daydream. And the daydream was about what he was going through exactly at that time. And he imagined himself in a lecture hall, a very comfortable scenario, talking about what he was going through at that moment. That's what led him to this conclusion and this quote from Spinoza at the top of page 74. Another key concept, obviously for Frankl, by now you've picked up on this, is the concept of hope. And so he gives the example on page 75 of an individual who was certain that he knew that the day that the camp would be liberated. Well, the day came and went, and the individual, everybody thought, caught typhus and died. Frankl said he didn't die from typhus. What he died from was a lack of hope. He lost his hope. He lost his why, in a sense. He lost the ability to move forward because he had said it so clearly identified it so clearly with a certain date. We have to be careful of identifying things that we don't know with a certain date. And so now, just as has happened, who knows how, and millions of times probably in the history of the world, now we have people running around saying the end of the world is near. Well, it might be. It might come before the end of this video. But it's pretty risky to think that you know enough to set the date of the end of the world. This is what Frankl is referring to here. Hope always keeps looking toward the future, because the chances are we will keep existing, we will go on, there will be a future. So we need to focus very clearly on the why. Why do we do what we do? Why are we willing to engage in the active life, to be creative, to work hard, to go, as you're doing now, going through school? Why are we so interested in the enjoyable parts of life? What makes those so enjoyable? Just the pure pleasure, or is there something else to it? And particularly with regard to suffering, why are we willing to undergo unavoidable suffering? How do we know it's meaningful? And so Frankl, surprisingly perhaps to you, on page 76, about 2/3 of the way through page 76, quotes Nietzsche. Nietzsche we studied earlier in the semester. We looked at him as very nihilistic, very sort of dark in terms of his outlook on the world and the ability for us to know anything for certain and so forth. But here he quotes Nietzsche, who's said all kinds of things and very frequently actually, in a sense, kind of stumbled into the truth. Here he quotes Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. You have to think about those words. You have to let those words sink in for a little bit, right? He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. This applies to everything that you do in your life, all the challenges that you take up, and all of the suffering that you undergo. You have to know your why. You have to focus on it. You have to be clear about it. Maybe it'll change to some extent throughout life. The most ultimate why will probably never change. You need to figure that out too. That's part of the human being's search for truth. What's the ultimate meaning of human existence? What is that ultimate why? Where are we headed? And how are we going to get there? Now then, Frankl asks another question, or makes another statement with regard to this statement of Nietzsche's and our need to focus on the why. Top of page 77. He had to give a talk at one time to some men, and he said that the hardest thing to get people to focus on, and he was including himself, the hardest thing to teach the despairing men, top of page 77, was that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. Think about it, that's what really matters. What does life expect from us? We've got to turn the tables. We can't just sort of passively go through life, Frankl is saying, and just expect, okay, we're going to have meaning provided to us free of charge. It's what life expects from us. What is expected of us? What do we have to do? When do we have to do it? How do we have to do it? What challenges are we going to have to rise to? What sufferings are we going to have to go through? What difficulties are we going to have to try to figure out how to make meaningful? This is what Frankl is focusing on. And this is what he says a little bit further down on that same page in 77. This is what he says form our destiny. This forms our destiny. How we respond to these elements, these segments of life that constitute unavoidable sufferings. He gives many, many other instances of examples along these lines in the succeeding pages. Once again, at the top of page 82, interestingly enough, he quotes Nietzsche again. And this quote is a kind of a much more familiar quote. You've probably heard it around in different places. But it's still a good quote given the difficult circumstances that Frankl is saying that we have to make meaningful in our own way. The quote is at the top of page 82. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. Right? So, Frankl now gets to the end of that long period of imprisonment. And this is the period that he begins to speak of at page 84. This is the period of liberation. And the first thing that we think of if our ordeal is over, and sometimes our suffering is such that the ordeal will never be over. For example, the loss of a loved one. Well, that's going to be with us for the rest of our life, right? And so we've all probably had some experience, I know I have over the years, of having, all through my life, of having those who are somewhat close to me die at a very early and young age. And so some suffering never comes to an end in some way. Sometimes it does. Maybe it's an emotional distress that we recover from, an addiction that we recover from, physical injury that we recover from, and so forth. So this is what he's talking about in terms of the third stage of the prisoner's life. Liberation finally comes around. Things change. The guards are no longer guards. They've changed out of their uniforms. They're now walking around freely, trying to be friends, freely trying to offer the former prisoners cigarettes and so forth. And you would think that it would be a time of great jubilation. You would think that it would be a time of celebration. And to some extent, there was that element. However, there are a number of things that Frankl relates that indicate that there was more to it than that. It was more complicated philosophically and emotionally than just celebration. So, for example, some of the prisoners returned home, not to be met with sympathy, not to be met with, oh, well, we're so glad to see you, we're so happy you survived, but to be met sometimes with attitudes like, well, you know, we suffered too, it was hard on us also. And the prisoner from the concentration camp is thinking, well, yeah, sure, but you weren't in the concentration camp. And then think of the prisoners who, they've been gone for years, went back to their homes, only to find that those homes were now inhabited by complete strangers. They no longer had a home to which they could return. The most telling incident in this last section, which actually should have mentioned that to you, starts on page 84 and goes to page 93. The most telling incident that Frankl relates there, and this is where he comes up with the ideas of bitterness and disillusionment. It was an incident where he and another prisoner were walking around outside the concentration camp. They were free to kind of come and go as they wanted to. They were walking outside. They were walking through the fields that they had looked at previously, a very beautiful field surrounding the concentration camp. And they came up to a field of oats. And the other prisoner was going to kind of keep on walking, and Frankl caught his arm and stopped him. And the other prisoner kind of looked at him somewhat indignantly and said, "Why are you stopping me?" Because Frankl either said or indicated, he didn't think they should trample on this farmer's oats. And the prisoner, again, very indignantly said, "Why not? He worked right outside this concentration camp all these years, and he did not lift a finger to help us. He didn't do anything. Why shouldn't we trample on his oats?" Well, Frankl remarks on this at the top of page 91. He says, "Only slowly could these men be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has the right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been done to them." It's a very telling comment on the part of Viktor Frankl that he could recognize this after having been through what he has been through. Only slowly could they be guided back to what he calls it a commonplace truth, not something highly abstract, not something that takes a great intellectual to think of, the commonplace truth that no one has the right to do wrong, even if wrong has been done to them. This should sound familiar. This should sound, yes, like Socrates, right? You should never do injustice. You should never do wrong. It was hard, and it is hard. Now then, that brings us to the end of Viktor Frankl's main essay. The semester is rapidly coming to an end, as you know. And that reminds me that you did take a test not too long ago, end of March, and should you desire to know your grades for that, just send me an email and I'll send it back to you. We have another class left on Frankl, Monday's class number 13, wherein we'll consider that the essay, which is in the second half of the book, which he entitled Local Therapy in a Nutshell. And then we will have just sort of a general review class, the class which will be our online class number 14, which is designated for Wednesday, April 22nd. So we'll have a kind of a general wrap up. And at that time, I'll tell you, what the final exams are going to be like. And of course, the paper. I'm going to try to attach the paper guidelines every time from now on. So in case you've misplaced those, you can turn in the paper anytime. As soon as you finish it, just turn it in. You don't have to wait till the deadline. And when I get the final exam to you, which will be very likely before you would have actually been scheduled to take the final exam, you can take it and turn it in whenever you want. I'll give you a deadline. It'll probably be a little bit longer than what it would normally be. I'll build in a little extra time there. But if you finish anything early, just send it on, right? So let's keep the ball rolling. All right. I will see you again next time when we will plan to finish up Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning.